Module 6, Relational Summary Lecture, GNE2, Urban Ecology. Let's talk about cities. I'm talking about the subject I studied in graduate school, what we refer to as urban ecology. Now, lots of people don't think that's a thing. Sounds contradictory to them, right? Urban and ecology in the same breath, getting along? Unthinkable. Well, yes and no. It's true that most cities are the problem, not only in and of themselves with their wholesale conversion of once biodiverse meadow and forest and wetland into lifeless brick and mortar and concrete, and the huge emissions of greenhouse gases like CO2 and carbon monoxide and CFCs and toxins from their factories and vehicles and office buildings and apartment buildings and shopping centers and lawns, to say nothing of the disproportionate amount of garbage they produce, garbage which ends up in landfills or dumped in the ocean, killing wildlife and emitting overwhelming amounts of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxides. But one also has to look at the sheer ecological footprint of cities and their suburban feeder zones and the rural areas filled with factory farms that only exist to serve the insatiable appetites of urban populations. Today, more than 60% of the human race lives in cities, and the number is rising. And the vast majority of urban centers are in the north. So there's no way to talk about the ecology of the North and how it's being affected by climate disruption without talking about its most salient feature, a feature all too obvious to astronauts looking down at the Earth from outer space at night: cities. And to see how much the Earth has changed and how much urbanization and development there's been in merely the last 25 years, just look at these time-lapse pictures compiled by Google from NASA's Landsat program. It should be enough to sober you up real quick. And it underscores a principal cause of climate change, strangely not often invoked: landscape change. You see, we now know that soil is the most efficient absorber of carbon dioxide and methane and nitrogen, a literal sequestering organism. Soil is not mere dirt with nutrients for plants. It's a living ecosystem that is carbon negative, and growing soil has been ranked as one of the most important drawdown solutions we have. The superb documentary Kiss the Ground has interviews with scientists and farmers and policymakers that lead one to the conclusion that regenerating soil could not only draw down enough carbon per year to offset our current emissions, but actually reverse global warming. The initiative claiming this is called 4 per thousand, and it was started by France at the COP21 in 2015. The idea is, quote, an annual growth rate of 0.4% in the soil carbon stocks, or 4% per year, in the first 30 to 40 centimeters of soil would significantly reduce the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere related to human activities. This growth rate is not a normative target for each country, but is intended to show that even a small increase in the soil carbon stock, agricultural soils, notably grasslands and pastures and forest soils, is crucial to improve soil fertility and agricultural production and to contribute to achieving the long-term objective of limiting the temperature increase to the plus 2 degrees Celsius threshold, beyond which the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, indicates that the effects of climate change are significant. The 4 per thousand initiative is intended to complement those necessary efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally and generally in the economy as a whole. It is voluntary. It is up to each member to define how they want to contribute to the goals, end quote. Now, if we can do more than 4 per thousand, we could get to that reversal I was talking about. But here's the thing. While we've been destroying our soils around the world, we've been changing the landscape so significantly, not just through desertification, but through urbanization, that there really isn't room for soil ecology now. You know the song, don't you? Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Ooh la 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 la, ooh la la la. The ecology of the North has largely been replaced by parking lots and pavement and concrete and cement and cinder block and brick and mortar. If ever one could be said to be living in the Stone Age, this would be it. As thesoilstory.com says, quote, the regeneration of soil is the task of our generation, end quote. But can we regenerate something if there's no longer any place for it? In a previous climate class, PCGS students and I made a little movie called Landscape Change and Global Crowding. about an argument between two students, one a stereotypical climate skeptic and the other a stereotypical climate change activist. Instead of focusing the argument on whether or not climate change and global warming were real, we had them argue about whether landscape change and global crowding were real. You can see it in the lesson videos. The idea was to see if we could first get consensus that there has been anthropogenic or human-caused landscape change, and whether we could get skeptics to agree that the world on average has gotten more crowded. The data should be incontrovertible regarding these two observable hypotheses. And from there, we derive the idea that humans obviously have enough agency to drive large-scale changes despite our small size relative to the Earth. And we then ask if we can get consensus that there's been seascape change or a literal sea change in the oceans due to human activity. There has. From there, we build the argument to ask whether we can agree there's been changes in the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and especially the biosphere. Given the interconnectedness of all these spheres of influence, of these imbricated systems, it isn't hard to then look at the planet from a mass balance equation perspective and determine that we must therefore be causing major changes in the atmosphere. In fact, it seems ridiculous not to conclude that climate change, which is the net effect of forcing changes from all these spheres, is primarily anthropogenic. And it makes sense. If soil ecology is the major current carbon sequestration location, and if we're rapidly releasing most of the stored carbon in the lithosphere due to the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, then landscape change is the ultimate predictor of and evidence for climate change. And this is because the only system capable of rapidly reclaiming all that carbon in a fixed form is the soil, given that the oceans, which normally are capable of absorbing the lion's share of carbon dioxide, are already acidifying, which creates a runaway feedback loop that dissolves shells and coral and limestone, releasing ever more carbon back into the water and the atmosphere. And if we're paving over all that formerly soil-rich land from sea to shining sea, and if we're transforming what's left to grow plants into factory farms that are basically dirt saturated with chemical salts and biocides, and desertifying the rest, there's no reasonable way to draw that carbon down fast enough to prevent catastrophic warming over 2 degrees centigrade. Right now, as they remind us in thesoilstory.com, quote, soil degradation poses a threat to more than 40% of the Earth's land surfaces, end quote. And these are just the ones that still have soil on them. So this is where urban ecology comes in. You see, if we can conceive of our cities and suburbs as a mere lifting of the lithosphere, of rocks and dirt and other inert materials paved over and moved up in the z-axis, then there's no reason besides politics, tradition, or ignorance that we can't soil over the man-made surfaces we've created. Every roof and building, and yes, every parking lot, could become a paradise of carbon-sequestering soil and associated vegetation and either crops or wildlife. Can you envision it? The problem isn't really the presence of humans, is it? It's more the presence of tar and shingle and concrete over what was once soil. And the wonderful thing about cities is that we've already created the infrastructure to irrigate and bring water and moisture and nutrients to the process of creating an urban soil and food production ecology. You see, the water pipes are all there in the city. The sprinkling systems are all there. Hell, as I witnessed in Cairo 15 years ago, even air conditioners can be used to condense water out of thin air and irrigate rooftop gardens. All air conditioners are doing it all the time, making liquid water out of the atmosphere. But the water is almost never put to productive use. Also, buildings actually can be used to increase the amount of useful solar energy available, to increase the amount of arable land surface rather than degrading it. You see, when you grow on flat ground in the North Temperate Zone, where the sun's rays come in at an angle, for North America and Europe, we're talking about roughly 25 to 65 degrees north latitude, a substantial amount of sunlight is just reflected away from the crop. As anybody who's played with solar panels knows, the best angle for energy production is when the sun's rays are perpendicular to the surface. If I rotate the panel, you get reflection, see? But when you grow plants on the wall of a south-facing building, you capture more of the light, and the taller the building, the more land you actually have created. You can therefore think of the built environment in two ways. One is a mere lifting of the flat earth in the z-axis. You haven't lost any growing space, you've merely lifted it up. And that's what rooftop gardens take advantage of. But at the same time, you've basically created a mountain slope by pushing that roofland up and making a perpendicular slope, albeit a very steep mountain slope. It can nonetheless be used to grow an enormous amount of vegetation, as these images show. Now, I didn't believe it myself until I journeyed to Madrid and stood in front of one of their famous green buildings near the art museum in the city center. Think of all that wasted surface area in normal cities, and how much more we can do in the urban environment than in the countryside if we put our minds to it. Dr. Dixon Despommier of Columbia University champions the idea of cities as solution in his seminal book, The Vertical Farm, Feeding the World in the 21st Century. He describes in detail how a new urban ecology can be created, even using existing infrastructure. All current buildings in our cities pipe fresh water up to the roof and carry contaminated water, in quotes, down in sewage pipes. The energy investment has already been made getting the water up, and gravity takes care of bringing it down. Additionally, cities have enormous amounts of surface area, rooftops, balconies, porches, parking structures, roads and parking lots and pavement that can capture rainfall. This makes cities the perfect place for agriculture, particularly because after use and on its way down, the water is laden with nutrients. Yes, the phosphorus in our soaps and detergents, and the nitrogen and potassium in our toilet wastes, along with the micronutrients we wash out of our food and beverage containers, make for nearly ideal irrigation water. So think of it this way. Clean water is piped up to the top of a building from a reservoir, supplemented by rainwater, picks up nutrients from our urine and feces and cleaning materials when we wash our hands and wash the dishes, and this liquid fertility in the gray water and black water is used to grow carbon sequestering and nutritious plants on the levels immediately below. Despommier is one of many visionaries who've influenced me to see our cities as the solution rather than the problem. As an urban planner, I share the obsession to transform our cities into ecological paradises. And years ago, as a graduate student in UCLA's urban planning department, I presented a paper at a planning conference in Belgium called Looking Towards Zootopia. This was decades before the Disney Pixar film Zootopia came out. My argument was based partially on the work of Austrian artist and architect Friedensreich Hundertwasser, who not only conceived of the idea of what he called the tree tenant project, but actually built examples of it in apartment buildings in Vienna in the early 1980s. The tree tenant project involved installing composting toilets on top floors in the buildings and using the rich humus they created to grow trees in the units below, with the branches and leaves trained to reach out the window and vegetate the side of the building. The tree tenant website contains the original writings of the artist and says, quote, "Written in pieces between 1980 through 1996, the following text describes Hundertwasser's original concept of tree tenants. The tree tenant project seeks to understand how to reconcile this vision of revegetating the built environment within the context of decaying housing stock, rising rents, and declining availability of affordable housing in cities with growing homeless populations." Tree tenants are the ambassadors of the free forests in the city. They say, tree tenants can be seen from far away and benefit many people, also those who walk around the house and dwell nearby. The tree tenant symbolizes a turn in human history because he regains his rank, the tree, as an important partner of man. The relationship man-vegetation must have again religious dimensions. Only if you love the tree like yourself will you survive. We suffocate in our cities through poison and lack of oxygen. We destroy systematically the vegetation which gives us life and lets us breathe. We walk alongside gray and sterile facades of houses. It's our duty to reinstall the rights of nature by all means. Cars have chased the trees up into the stories of houses. We suffer daily from the aggressivity and the tyranny of our vertical, sterile high walls. But streets in the cities will become green valleys again, where man can breathe freely again. Tree tenants dwell inside the walls of the house in an area of about 1 square meter behind the windows. The windows are set back and you can look at the tree tenant from inside and look outside. The tree tenant has 1 cubic meter of soil at his disposal and can become quite big. The tree tenant pays his rent in much more valuable currency than the humans. 1, tree tenants create oxygen. 2, tree tenants improve the city climate and the well-being of dwellers. They bring the needed moisture into the desert climate of the city, reduce the dry, humid, and the cold-warm contrast. 3. Tree tenants act like vacuum cleaners. More so, they swallow even the finest and poisonous dust. There's less dust in the apartment and in the street. 4. Tree tenants swallow noise. They reduce the echoes of the city noise and create quietness. 5. Tree tenants protect you from outside views like curtains and create shelter. 6. Tree tenants give shadow in summer but let sunlight through in winter when leaves have fallen. 7. Butterflies and birds come back. 8. Beauty and joy of life come back. Living quality is improved with this piece of own nature. 9. The tree tenant is a symbol of reparation towards nature, which is extremely visible. We restore to nature a tiny piece of the huge territories which man has taken away from nature illegally. The tree tenant is a giver. It's a piece of nature, a piece of homeland, a piece of spontaneous vegetation in the anonymous and sterile city desert, a piece of nature which can develop without the rationalist control of man and his technology, end quote. It's a beautiful vision, and more importantly, it was actually demonstrated in Europe. I've taken my German children to see the Hundertwasser-designed Ronald McDonald Hospice for children in the urban paradise called the Gruga Park, which is constantly hosting sustainability exhibits. That building went even further than Hundertwasser's original designs by incorporating a gently sloping roof that winds around the building covered in vegetation. That we don't see more of vegetation-friendly designs like these has far less to do with technology, cost, or practicality, especially given the values Hundertwasser showed we can extract as rent from tree tenants. It has much more to do with a lack of vision or courage among the rest of us. And so with notable exceptions like the green roof movements in Chicago and Germany and the remnants of the early green city movements led by visionary planners like Ebenezer Howard and Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park in Manhattan and the 13 oases of the Olmsted Falls project in Ohio, among other early 20th century city beautiful projects, the densest places of human habitation today are among the most ecologically deficient. And let's not even talk about all those suburban front lawns posing as green spaces. From an ecological point of view, they are monocrop mausoleums, and actually are worse than mere graveyards, since their maintenance with mowing, clipping, weed whacking, trimming, fertilizing, and pesticiding creates more greenhouse gases than they could possibly sequester by an order of magnitude. When you add the burning or landfilling of raked tree leaves, to say nothing of people using fossil-powered leaf blowers, you can see how so-called lawn and garden is quite the opposite of the soil-building drawdown solution that greening the urban and suburban landscape is designed to promote. It's a stark reminder that just as all that glitters is not gold, all that glimmers is not green. But let us not despair. The promise is there. A recent New York Times bestseller that gave many New Yorkers hope is Ed Glazer's Triumph of the City: How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. He cites ideas that harken back to what I was taught at UCLA by urban economics professor Michael Storper regarding agglomeration economies and untradeable interdependencies. The idea is simple. The more people you have in an area, the more fungible capital you've agglomerated or pulled together. Financial capital on Wall Street, of course, but also intellectual capital in Columbia and NYU and City University of New York and Fordham and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Pratt School of Design and Fashion Institute of Technology and Mercy College, to name just a few. And social capital in Andrew Faust's permaculture groups at the Brooklyn Commons. Did you know that more than one tree grows in Brooklyn? And all the hacker spaces in the Triborough area and book clubs in people's living rooms. And cultural capital in places like the New York Public Library and the Museum of Metropolitan Art and the Guggenheim and the Natural History Museum. And then there's the spiritual capital in houses of worship like St. Patrick's Cathedral and St. John the Divine Church, where I first went with my dad to hear Pulitzer Prize-winning biologist René Dubos speak about their rooftop gardens to feed the poor when I was a 14-year-old high school student. And then there's the Greenberg Hebrew Center, which went solar several years back and where I was working with the head rabbi on urban composting programs. And there's material capital in the form of a planet-wide stream of resource of resources coming in by shipping containers to New York Harbor, passing the Statue of Liberty every day, to say nothing of the experiential capital of generations of New Yorkers who witnessed firsthand the devastation of Manhattan Island when the verdant forested hunting and meeting ground of the Lenni, Lenape, and other Native Americans was stolen and turned into a concrete jungle. New Yorkers experienced the horrors of sweatshops and slums and horrid environmental injustices, and they tried to correct them with Frederick Law Olmsted Central Park, and with Prospect Park and the Prospect Park Zoo and the Bronx Botanical Gardens and Bronx Zoo and other planned green spaces. They lost terrible battles when master builder and all-around megalomaniac Robert Moses created the modern urban landscape and inspired white flight from the inner cities and turned them into slums and normalized commuting from the suburbs. But the point is that the collective memory is there. Experiential capital is rich in cities. And the very disappointment and disgust so many urban dwellers have in how the city has evolved is the anvil upon which our hope rests. In fact, I would argue that the only thing that makes cities still so dismal is that they're overwhelmingly lacking in the most important form of capital listed in the typical chart of the 8 forms of capital. Living capital, often referred to as natural capital. It is the dearth of this fundamental form of capital that makes cities so uncomfortable. Recall that the London-based German Jewish economist Karl Marx, steeped in spiritual capital-intensive traditions of justice-seeking going back to Moses ben Maimonides and Baruch Spinoza, wrote extensively about natural capital being the foundation of all economics, and went on the record with Engels as profoundly concerned about the growing metabolic rift between countryside and city, with living capital and material capital from forests and fields and farms being transformed into financial capital in the city, and the residuals of production being flushed down the Thames River into the sea, creating a capital drain of debt and net loss to the countryside that would be almost impossible to repay. Based on these concerns of our linear cradle-to-grave economy, Marx predicted the eventual demise of capitalism, being undone by its own internal contradictions. But if the city could recreate, regenerate, and sustain living capital, why then the city is actually the best place for a true circular economy and drawdown center to evolve. One form of capital would simply endlessly transmute into another, of course obeying the laws of thermodynamics that Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen wrote about in his 1971 magnum opus, The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. But it would be powered by endless geothermal and solar power and their derivatives, as predicted by Thomas Edison from his labs and the electric car company he ran with industrialist Henry Ford across the river in New Jersey. You will find when you do a deep dive into urban ecology, even forgetting the ancient hanging gardens of Babylon, where hydroponics and aquaponics started at the beginning of civilization, that the megacities of the north alone could do more to heal the planet than just about anywhere else. Our cities are the best place for drawdown solution number 73, green roofs, expected to reduce 0.77 gigatons of CO2 with a net investment of $1.39 trillion and a net savings of $988.5 billion. They are also the perfect venue for LED lighting, both household, solution number 33, with its 7.81 gigaton reduction estimated to cost $323.5 billion and saving $1.73 trillion, and commercial solution number 44, drawing down 5.04 gigatons CO2 at a startling net cost of negative $205.1 billion and a net savings of $1.09 trillion. Just look again at the lights of the city taken from space, and that becomes obvious. But something else comes into play here. With tuned LEDs using so little energy, the bright lights of the city can also be used to grow food and do carbon sequestering vegetation on the north side of buildings, to say nothing of east and west, places that receive no direct sunlight. So the city now becomes multiple times more productive than any farmland could ever be. And what's even cooler is that LEDs use so little energy that they can be powered by solar cells. It's a sort of one-to-one correspondence, because LEDs actually are backwards solar cells. One takes light and turns it into electricity, the other takes electricity and turns it into light. So a solar city really is possible. And that's why my NGO is called Solar Cities, because we can. And there are so many other drawdown solutions that can be most easily done in cities. I'll leave it to you to explore all the possibilities. But if we can close the metabolic rift that cities originally caused, and rethink and redesign our cities as solutions instead of problems, then our modern trend of urbanization, with more than 60% of us in what we call the built environment, can be turned from the worst into the best thing that ever happened to humanity. And by using our postmodern understanding of ecology to reintegrate biodiverse living capital, we can not just reduce our bad ecological footprint, but increase our good ecological footprint, drawing down carbon every time we order takeout and every time we get on the subway. Imagine that, the city as solution. As the Chinese are fond of saying, every mouth that is born with 2 hands to feed it. Our cities may be filled with a-holes, but just remember, those a-holes come with hands and eyes and ears and brains, and they produce the raw material for urban agriculture. So the next time you feel depressed about the number of people living in the city, think of that. All we have to do is bring back all the trees and shrubs and birds and bats and other animals who actually love living in the city for the same reason as we do, and transform every available space in our urban habitat into something productive. And in this way, the human ecology and the urban ecology of the North holds the key to a healthy, happy future.